Good morning and welcome to episode 7 of Rebecca. I have a few things for you first before we dive back into the novel. I don't know about you, but I hope you're enjoying this, especially towards the end where it's practically a page turner. But here's some insight into villainy and gender in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. This is by Oba Lampard Pons. It's a translation from Spanish. She's at the University of Barcelona. In any case, this is pretty interesting. She says, in this article, I propose that villainy in this novel is not exclusively linked to gender, and therefore the victim and abuser statuses cannot be equated to femininity and masculinity, respectively. She says, the villainy in the novel is inextricably connected to being in a powerful position within a patriarchy, and that it is the desire to maintain this position and perpetuate the patriarchal system that leads the main characters, men and women, to commit acts of villainy. So then she also says, criticism of Rebecca is divided into those who read it as a Gothic love story in which a virtuous woman triumphs over an evil one by winning the love of a gentleman, and those who identify the novel as a reworking of the Bluebeard tale, in which the gentleman actually turns out to be a villain who unjustifiably murdered his first wife. The novel was originally advertised and sold, emphasizing the former interpretation. Rebecca was touted to booksellers as an exquisite love story with a brilliantly created atmosphere of suspense. It was promoted and sold, in short, as a Gothic novel. Gothic romance. This traditional reading of du Maurier's novel as a romance became even more popular thanks to Alfred Hitchcock's 1940 adaptation. Hitchcock makes the novel more unambiguously romantic. To achieve this effect, Hitchcock made Maxime more important and more sympathetic by rewriting Maxime's murder of Rebecca as an unfortunate and practically self-inflicted accident for which he feels irrationally guilty. That's in the movie. These changes in the film are significant insofar as they have influenced readers and critics' reading of the story. Even recently, some critics still project the film's more romantic vision on du Maurier's text, claiming that Mrs. De Winter's decision to become Maxime's faithful wife improves her situation in the end, which it does, overlooking the fact that this means being married to a murderer. There's an unusual irony, wouldn't you say? So I got a little bit of insight from Bernadette. I just have to find it because it's really interesting about Bernadette last week said, you're probably already aware of this, but the 1940 Hitchcock film of Rebecca is a real gem. Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine gave an outstanding performance, and Margaret Anderson as Mrs. Danvers is the best portrayal of a menacing character that I've ever seen. So the point here is that Mrs. Danvers portrays villainy from the female perspective, which is what this author is saying. So that was from Bernadette last week, but it really was interesting because it's being emphasized by this critic. She goes on to say, not Bernadette, the critic goes on to say that this reading of Rebecca as a romance has been revised and rejected by feminist critics who point out that Du Maurier is using the unreliable narrator technique. Well, we know that is partly true because an I speaker is often unreliable. We're only getting the I speaker's point of view. Rebecca is only romance if the reader confines him or herself to the narrator's viewpoint. Yet, if the reader questions the unreliable judgments of the narrator, the novel seems to be telling a very different story about the ill treatment that women suffer at the hands of men. How many times have we seen that in novels? That especially in this period, late 1800s to early 1900s, that the feminist position was at a disadvantage. However, this standard feminist interpretation of Du Maurier's text has consisted mainly of inverting the main character's roles. If the traditional reading sustained that the dead wife, Rebecca, was the villainess that interfered with the harmony of the heterosexual couple, which she clearly does, Watson claims the opposite. Rebecca is a Gothic heroine, and the husband, Maxine, the Blackbeard figure, who not only murdered his first wife, but also oppresses and alienates the second Mrs. De Winter. This critic argues pretty much full circle that in one place the male character Maxime is the villain because he murdered his wife, and then simultaneously we get Rebecca, who is the villainess, and in the end, did I tell you that? In the end, the second Mrs. De Winter stays with Maxime, even though he's a murderer. It's circular. The common assumption about Rebecca's figures that the first Mrs. De Winter, as a secretly conniving manipulator who convinced the world that she was as morally flawless as she was beautiful. According to the second Mrs. De Winter, the narrator of the novel, Maxime murdered Rebecca justifiably. Only he knew the true corrupt Rebecca. What if, however, Maxime is the one who is lying, and Rebecca was as good as her reputation held her, if his jealousy was the true motive for the murder? Isn't that fascinating? We can't forget that the second Mrs. De Winter is the I speaker, and that her view of Rebecca may not be reliable. I just thought that was immensely interesting. Thus, reading Maxime as a Gothic villain seems to automatically imply that Rebecca is the feminine heroine, a woman whose worst crime was simply that she resisted male definition, asserting her right to define herself and her desires. So, I'm sure that you probably got to the point at the end of this novel where you couldn't put it down. Yesterday, I was supposed to be putting the lecture together and couldn't put the novel down. I haven't read this in a while, and I kind of forgot some of the details at the end. If we pick up in the novel where we stopped, which was page 246, we see Mrs. Danvers playing the role of the villainess. Let's see, at the top of page 246, I forget where we stopped, and I think it was right here. Mr. De Winter is not happy, she said, turning to look at me at last. Any fool can see that. You have only to look at his eyes. He's still in hell, and he's looked like that ever since she died. That's interesting because we know that Mrs. Danvers is the advocate for Rebecca. She goes on. The eye speaker says, it's not true. It's not true. He was happy when we were in France together. He was younger, much younger, and laughing and gay. And that's that idea that the further they get away from their honeymoon, the more oppressed they seem to be. She goes on, Well, he's a man, isn't he? No man denies himself on a honeymoon, does he? Mr. De Winter is not 46 yet. She laughed contemptuously. So then if we look at the bottom of page 246, um, Mrs. Danvers says, Mrs. De Winter won't be in to tea till 5, and all the while, my Mrs. De Winter, my lady with her smile and her lovely face and brave ways, the real Mrs. De Winter, lying dead and cold and forgotten in the church crypt. If he suffers, then he deserves to suffer, marrying a young girl like you, not 10 months afterwards. So there's all kinds of indictment coming from Mrs. Danvers. Down at the bottom of the page, he made his own hell, and there's no one but himself to thank for it. He knows he knows she sees him. He knows she comes by night and watches him. And she doesn't come kindly, not she, not my lady. She was never one to stand mute and still be wronged. I'll see them in hell, Danny, she'd say. I'll see them in hell first. There's a suggestion that Rebecca comes as a ghost at night. So far, we certainly haven't seen any ghosts, but perhaps she is being figurative and suggesting that Rebecca, in fact, haunts the place because she's everywhere. She's pervasive. Down at the bottom of page 247, I watched her, fascinated, horrified. A queer, ecstatic smile was on her lips, making her older than ever, making her skull's face vivid and real. Her face is always described as a skull's face. At the bottom of page, oh no, at the top of page 248, we have her, I can see her now with her hair flying out behind her, slashing at him, drawing blood, digging the spurs into his side. What? Is she abusing this horse? So I was a little horrified by that. And then at the end of that paragraph on the top of 248, abusing the horse like that, to me, is really a revealing detail. So if we just return to that article, who's the villain? At the end of that paragraph, she cared for nothing and for no one. And then she was beaten in the end. But it wasn't a man. It wasn't a woman. The sea got her. The sea was too strong for her. The sea got her in the end. Or did it? Couple paragraphs down. She turned on me fiercely. Leave me alone, can't you? She said. What's it to do with you? If I show my grief, I'm not ashamed of it. I don't shut myself up in my room to cry. I don't walk up and down in my room like Mr. De Winter with the door locked on me. That is a detail that you'll need to remember because he's pacing, and we see him pacing later on as well, and we see other people pacing back and forth, back and forth. This is something that Du Maurier keeps bringing up, and it is a suggestion of distress. Just hold that. Then over on the next page, 249, he was jealous while she lived, and now he's jealous when she's dead, said Mrs. Danvers. He forbids Mr. Jack the house now like he did then. That shows you he's not forgotten her, doesn't it? So Mr. Jack, of course, is Rebecca's cousin, and the eye speaker can hardly reconcile the fact that Mr. Jack is Rebecca's cousin because Mr. Jack's kind of crude and kind of he's just crude, and she doesn't. The eye speaker doesn't care for him, but we get insight from Mrs. Danvers about how about what's going on between Mr. Jack and Rebecca. Just hold that thought too. Mrs. Danvers is laying little crumbs of information at the end of page 249. I've seen them here, staying in the house. Men she'd meet up in London and bring for weekends. She would take them bathing from the boat. She would have a picnic supper at her cottage in the cove. Do you think that's weird? They made love to her, of course. Who would not? She laughed. She would come back and tell me that what they had said and what they had done. She did not mind. It was like a game to her, like a game. And later, like 100 pages from now, we're going to hear her saying the same thing, that playing with these men was like a game. She's like enticing them. But she's married. Something not quite right there. 250. Who wouldn't be jealous? They were all jealous, all mad for her. Mr. De Winter, Mr. Jack, Mr. Crawley, everyone who knew her, everyone who came to Manderley. So Rebecca doesn't seem, from Mrs. Danvers' point of view, she doesn't seem like she's out of line. But there's that suggestion that her own desires were something that she played with. Next paragraph. She's still mistress here, even if she is dead. This is what the eye speaker really worries about. She's the real Mrs. De Winter, not you. It's you that's the shadow and the ghost. It's you that's forgotten and not wanted and pushed aside. Well, why don't you leave Manderley to her? Why don't you go? Mrs. Danvers is just so mean. 2 paragraphs later. Why don't you go? She said. We none of us want you. He doesn't want you. He never did. He can't forget her. He wants to be alone in the house again with her. It's you that ought to be lying there in the church crypt, not her. It's you who ought to be dead, not Mrs. De Winter. It's so mean. 2 paragraphs later, 250. Don't be afraid, said Mrs. Danvers. So they're standing at the open window. I won't push you. I won't stand by you. You can jump on your own accord. What's the use of you staying here at Manderley? You're not happy. Mr. De Winter doesn't love you. There's not much for you to live for, is there? Why don't you jump now and have done with it? Then you won't be unhappy anymore. Yikes. Go back to that picture or that article that talks about who is the villain and who has the power. Well, Mrs. Danvers certainly has some power here, but she's saying, I won't push you. Just jump. Why don't you jump? Whispered Mrs. Danvers. Why don't you try? The fog came thicker than before at the top of 251. Remember how in a Gothic novel, the weather can emphasize people's states of mind. And here we have the fog coming in. And of course, a fog in a person's mind is lack of clarity. Top of 251, there was nothing but the white mist about me, smelling of seaweed, dank and chill. End of that paragraph. The fall would break my neck. It would not be slow, like drowning. Pay attention to the details surrounding drowning, because later on, the detective, and I think we're getting to that today, the detective says that drowning is painless. And here, it's slow. The fall would break my neck. It would not be slow like drowning. It would soon be over, and Maxine did not love me. Maxine wanted to be alone again with Rebecca. So Mrs. Danvers is just planting these fears, or emphasizing the fears she already has. And then at the bottom of the page 251, what is it? I said stupidly, what has happened? Oh, the explosions. Remember the explosions? That's how at the time ships alerted that they were in trouble. Mrs. Danvers relaxed her grip on my arm. She stared out of the window into the fog. It's the rockets. There must be a ship gone ashore there in the bay. We listened, staring into the white fog together. That fog is not clear, but the fog also causes this ship to go aground. Next, chapter 19. Mrs. Danvers drew back from the window. Her face was expressionless once more, the cold white mask that I knew. over at the top of page 253. There's an interesting phrase here. When you see Mr. De Winter, madam, will you tell him it will be quite all right if he wants to bring the men back from the ship? There will be a hot meal ready for them any time. Yes, I said. Yes, Mrs. Danvers. I thought that was an interesting phrase because there seems to be a reversal here of mistress and housekeeper. The I speaker says, yes, Mrs. Danvers. She obeys her. Down at the bottom of page 253. Well, it's hardly to be wondered at this fog, madam. That's what I said to Robert just now. It's difficult to find your way on the road, let alone on the water. Emphasizing that fog at the top of page 254. Again, the fog. I could see the trees taking shape beyond the lawns. The fog was lifting. It was rising in little clouds to the sky above. It whirled above my head in wreaths of smoke. I looked up at the windows above my head. They were tightly closed and the shutters were fastened. The fog is lifting. Then several paragraphs later, it's about a quarter of the way up from the bottom. It's a very warm morning, madam, very warm indeed. Oppressive, one might say. Notice how many times the word oppressive is used. Next paragraph. Yes, Frith, very oppressive. Who's oppressing whom? Mrs. Danvers. 255, again with the fog. The fog was rising, lifting to the tops of the trees. She's now outside, and outside is different from inside. Inside Manderley is where it's oppressive. Outside, I could see the woods at the end of the lawns, and above my head a pale sun tried to penetrate the heavy sky. It was hotter than ever. Oppressive, as Frith had said. But as she has gone outside, the fog lifts. It's almost as if that the house is the oppressor. At the bottom of 255, I felt sick with shame at the memory of my words, and then I realized for the first time that Maxine had not gone away as I had feared. So following the dance, that was what we saw last class, following the dance, she thought Maxine was going to leave, like leave her altogether. And then she realizes that he's here. Top of page 256, we see the shipwreck. A ship that really has gone aground. I had just experienced something that was degrading and horrible and mad. This conversation with Mrs. Danvers. Something that I did not fully understand even now, that I had no wish to remember, that I wanted to bury forever more deep in the shadows of my mind with the old forgotten terrors of childhood. So she's seeing the fog has lifted. She's outside and she has a moment of clarity about the horror and the degradation of Mrs. Danvers and her treatment of her. Go to the bottom of page 257. I don't know about you, but these numbers are really small. I have trouble seeing them. I thought how alike people were in a moment of common interest. Frank was Frith all over again, giving his version of the story. Pay attention to that. Whose version of the story do we believe in the end? I knew that he had been frightened as I had been. And wait, I lost my place. As though it mattered, as though we cared. I knew that he had gone down to the beach to look for Maxime. I knew that he had been frightened as I had. And now all this was forgotten, put aside, our conversation down the telephone, our mutual anxiety, his insistence that he must see me, all because a ship had gone ashore in the fog. So remember that conversation. Frank kept saying, I have to talk to you. I have to talk to you. And she said, no, I don't want to talk to you. And it was all of this lack of clarity was put aside because of the shipwreck. Oh, what are we going to see with the shipwreck? I don't know about you, but can you hear Daphne? This is what she wants. The bottom of 258. Maxime is splendid at anything like this, said Frank. He always gives a hand if he can. You find he will invite the whole crew back to Manderley and feed them and give them beds in the bargain. So, a little bit of insight into Maxime. He's clearly perceived as someone who does good. But I thought it was an interesting contrast because following the ball, Maxime's house is also open to people. There were several guests who stayed overnight, including his sister B and her husband Giles. I just thought that was an interesting contrast. At the bottom of 259, somehow I could not face Frank just at the moment. I wanted to be alone or with someone I did not know, like the Coast Guard. So we had seen her, there's a shift. We had seen her trying to become a part of Manderley, and now she wants to distance herself. Top of page 260. This is probably star worthy. All these things would be settled someday, one day. And then over on 261, she says, I wish I could lose my own identity and join them. She wants to join the people from the town of Kerith and just be anonymous. Instead of which I must go back alone through the woods to Manderley and wait for Maxime, and I will not know what we should say to one another, how he would look at me, and what would be his voice. Remember when he saw her coming down the stairs, he couldn't even talk. He was so angered by her appearance. So we have the shipwreck on the next page, and Ben is there on the shore, as he often is. And we're going to wonder now, what role is Ben going to play? One of the roles that he plays is he's disabled, and he often tells the truth. At the top of 263. She'll break up bit by bit. He's talking about the boat, the ship. She'll not sink like a stone like the little one. The fishes have eaten her up now, haven't they? And then down in the middle of the next page, 263, a little wind sprang from nowhere and blew into my face. A leaf fell onto my hand from the tree above. I shivered for no reason. The suggestion, like with all Gothic materials, the suggestion that there's some mystery here, and a leaf drops onto her hand, and there's a little breeze, and like, what? Is this a ghost? Is it supernatural? We don't know. But remember, one of the things that this book does, and other books like them, has the suggestion, this aura of mystery that is explainable. At the bottom of page 263, standing there, looking down upon it from the banks, I realized, perhaps for the first time, with a funny feeling of bewilderment and pride, that it was my home. I belonged there, and Manderley belonged to me. We are going to be seeing the eye speaker in a period of growth for herself. Mrs. Danvers has spooked her pretty badly, but if we look over on the next page, Manderley is almost like Eden. A thin column of smoke rose in the air from one of the chimneys. The new cut grass on the lawn smelt sweet as bay. I love the English use of smelt and learnt. A blackbird was singing on the chestnut tree. A yellow butterfly winged its foolish way before me to the terrace. Isn't that beautiful? And then at the bottom of page 264, it was queer, this feeling of marking time, like sitting in a waiting room at a dentist's. She frequently makes references to sitting in a doctor or a dentist waiting room. Who doesn't know what that feeling is like? It was as though I had entered into a new phase of my life. See, here's this development of herself. And nothing would be quite the same again. The girl who had dressed for the fancy dress ball the night before had been left behind. It had happened a very long time ago. The self who sat on the window seat was new and was different. So having, I'm sorry, not even sure why she's barking. Um, having made that mistake, the innocent girl walking down the stairs in that white dress, that in some ways was the white dress she never had for her wedding, this innocent girl, and it's a moment of growth. It's a fall from her innocence or taking a step away from her innocence. So that over at the next page, 266, um, so Captain Cyril has come and has said that he's not there because of the ship. He's got some business that he needs to take care of. And the business is that, of course, Rebecca's boat has been found. Down at the bottom of the page. He's a local man, of course, and he recognized the boat at once. It was the little boat belonging to the late Mrs. De Winter. Um, this fresh blow, and then next paragraph, this fresh blow coming swiftly upon my masquerade of the night before was ironic and rather horrible. Yeah. So in just a few pages, we've seen her get a little bit of enlightenment, and now this boat is found. And not only that, but there's a body in it. There was a body in there, page 267, lying on the cabin floor. He said quietly, it was dissolved, of course. There was no flesh on it, but it was a body, all right. He saw the head and limbs. Kind of horrifying, isn't it? So then, of course, the eye speaker says, well, she must have had a companion with her. Um, but that just adds to the mystery. There is a question. Surely relatives would know if anyone had been missing. There was so much about it at the time. It was all in the papers. Why should one of them be in the cabin and Mrs. De Winter herself be picked up miles away, months afterwards? That's a question. Therein lies the rub. At the bottom of 267, I knew now the reason for my sense of foreboding. It was not, turn the page, 268. It was not the stranded ship that was sinister, nor the crying gulls, nor the thin black funnel pointing to the shore. It was the stillness of the black water and the unknown things that lie beneath. Therein is the darkness that is at this place. Um, he says, I have to report the body. And then down at 268, in the big paragraph towards the bottom, it's about a third of the way up. The moment of crisis had come, and I must face it. My old fears, my diffidence, my shyness, my hopeless sense of inferiority must be conquered now and thrust aside. Good for you, I was saying to myself. And here's where I was reading, so fast. Mostly our books are not page turners. Mostly they're things that we must study diligently, but this became a page turner. I haven't read this in a while, and I thought, oh my gosh, no wonder this was one of my favorites. Next page, middle of the page. I don't want you to love me. I won't ask impossible things. I'll be your friend and your companion, a sort of boy. I don't ever want more than that. Isn't that interesting? I think that's really sad. Early on, she describes herself as a boy. And she is now trying to separate herself from her husband before he actually does it. I saw how thin his face was, how lined and drawn, and there were great shadows beneath his eyes. Again, that concept that as they get further away from their honeymoon, they are both declining, they're getting thinner, and maybe depressed. At Manderley, it's a beautiful place. Something is oppressive about it. He's got tortured eyes and his pale, drawn face. It's too late, my darling, too late, he said. We've lost our little chance of happiness. Yes, he says, the thing has happened. At the bottom, we're not meant for happiness, you and I. Rebecca has won. Boy, she's a dark one. 270 at the top. Her shadow between us all the time, he said. Her damned shadow keeping us from one another. He says, I knew this was coming. I remembered that slow, treacherous smile. She knew this would happen. Even then, she knew she would win in the end. He said, towards the bottom of this page, there was no one with Rebecca. She was alone. Last paragraph of this chapter. The woman buried in the crypt is not Rebecca. It's the body of some unknown woman, unclaimed, belonging nowhere. There never was an accident. Rebecca was not drowned at all. I killed her. I shot Rebecca in the cottage in the cove, carried her body to the cabin, and took the boat out that night and sunk it there where they found it today. It's Rebecca who's lying dead there in the cabin. Will you look into my eyes and tell me that you love me now? It's Rebecca, and he killed her, and he hated her. Isn't that an interesting irony? And she says to herself, time and tide wait for no man. Now remember how Du Maurier plays with time and has the I speaker think about time. But time doesn't stop, she says. When people suffer a great shock like death or the loss of a limb, I believe they don't feel it just at first. Next few lines, I was aware of no feeling at all, no pain and no fear. There was no horror in my heart. A few lines later, I was shocked at my lack of emotion and this queer, cold absence of distress. And then she says the jigsaw puzzle pieces were starting to come together. At the top of 272, I love you so much, he whispered, so much. That's the first time he has ever admitted that. This is what I have wanted him to say every day and every night. And now these horrifying circumstances are bringing this away from him. It's like the pall has lifted. The oppression from the person whose name is Rebecca has been lifted. Mid-page. I love you more than anything in the world, but when you kissed me just now, I felt stunned and shaken. I could not feel anything. I could not grasp anything. It was just as though I had no more feeling left in me at all. And now at the bottom of page 272, they found Rebecca. Over on 273, something happened nearly a year ago that altered my whole life. I had to begin living all over again. So the I speaker is revisiting the details that she could never put into place. And they're the puzzle pieces. If you had my memories, you would not go there either. Maxine pacing up and down the library after Rebecca died. Up and down, up and down. Remember I said? People pacing. I came away in rather a hurry, he said to Mrs. Van Hopper. The I speaker is remembering all of these details. And then he said at the top of 274, I killed Rebecca, he had said. I shot Rebecca in the cottage in the woods, and the diver had found her lying there on the cabin floor. Maxime did not answer. He stood there by the mantelpiece, his eyes wide and staring, looking in front of him, not seeing anything. Pay attention to Maxime's demeanor, because he often plays the Byronic hero, the dark and brooding man with a secret. That's what he is right here. Mid-page 274. I thought I should go mad, he said, sitting here day after day waiting for something to happen. Now we know what he was waiting for. He was waiting for somebody to discover that little boat. But it didn't come up. Mrs. Danvers, who I had not the courage to turn away, because with her knowledge of Rebecca, she might have suspected, she might have guessed. Now we know why she's still there. She's a skeleton bully. Bottom of the page. You're looking frightfully ill. Can't you go and see a doctor? B had said. I had to face them, all these people, knowing every word I uttered was a lie. Well, now we see why he was the dark and suffering, brooding Murderer. Dang. Bottom of page 274. The time we've wasted when we might have been together all those weeks and days. So she's saying that had he told her, they might not have suffered so much. They might not have been so aloof. You were so aloof, he said, always wandering into the garden with Jasper, going off on your own. You never came to me like this. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me? I thought you were unhappy, bored. I'm so much older than you. You seem to have more to say to Frank than you ever had to me. You were funny with me, awkward and shy. How could I come to you when I knew you were thinking of Rebecca? Yeah, he was thinking of Rebecca. He was thinking she was going to float up to the top. I knelt straight beside him. Whenever you touched me, I thought you were comparing me to Rebecca. Herein lies the problem. Whenever you thought you were comparing me to whenever you spoke to me or looked at me, walked with me in the garden, sat down to dinner, I felt you were saying to yourself, this I did with Rebecca, and this, and this. Next paragraph, 275. Um, this was such a shocker that I wrote OMG in the margin. He whipped round and looked at me as I sat there huddled on the floor. You thought I loved Rebecca? You thought I killed her, loving her? I hated her. I tell you, our marriage was a farce from the very start. She was vicious, damnable, rotten through and through. We never loved each other, never had one moment of happiness together. Rebecca was incapable of love and tenderness and decency. She was not even normal. Whoa, what a dark picture. If we look at the top of 276, she had breeding, brains, and beauty. And I believed her, or forced myself to believe her, but all the time I had a seed of doubt on the back of my mind. There was something about her eyes. And remember, one critic early in our study said that there's something about the facial expressions. The jigsaw pieces came together piece by piece, and the real Rebecca took shape and form before me, stepping from her shadow world like a living figure from a picture frame. And then a few lines later, an interesting bit of insight. Once more, I saw myself standing on the beach beside poor, startled Ben. Your kind, he said, not like the other one. Remember how these characters, the disabled characters, often play the truth speaker. But until now, the eye speaker didn't understand what was coming to her. Beauty, brains, and breeding. Oh my God, he said. He broke off abruptly. He went and stood by the window, looking out upon the lawn. Pay attention to how many times people look out that window, looking at the lawn. He's looking for something. Then he turned away and paced up and down the room once more. Next page, 277. There's remember this was early on. Mrs. Van Hopper had said to the eye speaker that you don't think that he really loves you, do you? It was really mean, but it's important because the idea of having your marriage fail early on was really a burden. It was people's fear. He said, and she knew I would do as she suggested. Come here to Manderley, throw the place open, entertain, have our marriage spoken of as the success of the century. There is a really big fear here of gossip. She knew I would sacrifice pride, honor, personal feeling, every damned quality on earth rather than stand before our little world after a week of marriage and have them know the things about her that she had told me then. She knew I would never stand in a divorce court and give her away, have fingers pointing at us, mud flung at us in the newspapers, all the people who belong down here whispering when my name was mentioned. The eye speaker feared that exact same thing. The gossip is what they feared. That's Manderley. That's the place that belongs to the chap who had that divorce case we read about. Next paragraph. They just have a horror of having been gossip fodder. You despise me, don't you? He said. You can't understand my shame and loathing and disgust. At the bottom of this page, I clung to one thing only and repeated it to myself over and over again. Maxine did not love Rebecca. He had never loved her. Never, never. They had never known one moment's happiness together. So Rebecca is now taking on the role of the villain. She'd been the villain because she haunted the place, but now we know that she was truly a villain. Top of 278. I thought about Manderley too much, he said. I put Manderley first before anything else, and it does not prosper, that sort of love. They don't preach about it in churches. Christ said nothing about stones and bricks and walls, the love that a man can bear for his plot of earth, his soil, his little kingdom. It does not come into the Christian creed. I thought that was a really interesting point because the Christian creed doesn't really come up all that much in this novel. But it's important because his obsession with Manderley became oppressive to the eye speaker. My heart was light like a feather floating in the air. He had never loved Rebecca. Isn't that an interesting turn of events? Next paragraph. The shame and the degradation, the lie we lived, she and I, the shabby, sordid farce we played together. So Rebecca had revealed to Maxine things about herself that he found horrifying. But rather than have people point fingers at them and say he's the guy who got divorced, he's willing to put up with Rebecca and have her cultivate Manderley. Top of 279. And so we lived, he said, month after month, year after year. I accepted everything because of Manderley. What she did in London did not touch me because it did not hurt Manderley. There are some hints here of some shenanigans, shall we say, going on, in just a hint. Then little by little, she began to grow careless. You know how a man, oh, that's an analogy. So that at first I was not quite sure, not quite certain. Well, not quite certain of what? That she's flirting with men in London. Then she started on Frank. Now, it took me a while to figure what started on Frank was. Frank was really uncomfortable with Rebecca's flirtation, which is what this turns out to be. She never left him alone, he said. She was always going down to his house, trying to get him to the cottage. Something about that cottage, boy. Next page, 280. How many pages do I have to go? At the end of that bigger paragraph. Let's see, where? I wondered how many people there were in the world who suffered and continued to suffer because they could not break out from their own web of shyness and reserve, and in their blindness and folly built up a great distorted wall in front of them that hid the truth. This was what I had done. I had built up false pictures in my mind and sat before them. I had never had the courage to demand the truth. So she's beginning, remember, we've seen all this growth in her. And and also, I think I mentioned this last week, she creates little stories, little vignettes about what she thinks is occurring. Those are the stories. At the bottom of this page, B never said a word to me, or I to her, but I think she guessed my life. I think she knew, even as Frank did. Rebecca grew cunning again. A little hint here that maybe B wasn't all that taken with Rebecca. But B, of course, never says anything. She might get hold of one of the workmen on the estate, someone from Kara, anyone, and then the bomb would have to fall. The gossip, the publicity I dreaded. So we a little bit of insight into his motivation. 281. She had a cousin, Maxine slowly, a fellow who had been abroad and was living in England again. He took to coming here, if ever I was away. Frank used to see him, a fellow called Jack Favell. Oh, that's her cousin. And he had a black, filthy record. Look at the top of 282. And I knew that I could not stand this life of lies and filth and deceit any longer. The thing had got to be settled, one way or the other. I thought I'd take a gun and frighten the fellow, frighten them both. So this is the history of how he came to shoot Rebecca. He says, "We lived this life of degradation long enough, you and I." And then he says, "You know the conditions. I've kept my part of our dirty, damnable bargain." So she looked very pale and very thin, he says. And then at the top, oh no, this is at the bottom of 283. So Rebecca says, and we don't really hear much from Rebecca, but we're getting Rebecca's response to Maxime from Maxime's story. "We could make you look very foolish, Danny and I," she said softly. "We could make you look so foolish that no one would believe you, Max. Nobody at all." Next two paragraphs. "If I had a child, Max," she said, "neither you nor anyone in the world would ever prove that it was not yours." Uh-oh. So remember, she's looking very pale and very thin on the previous page, and now she's suggesting that maybe she's expecting a baby. And she's, all I could think of is, I'm so glad we have DNA. But at the time, 1938, that's not an option. And she asks him, what you want what if I have a baby? And then when we die, this baby inherits Manderley. She always goes for the throat. Manderley, Manderley, Manderley. She turned around and faced me, smiling, one hand in her pocket, the other holding her cigarette. When I killed her, she was smiling still. I fired at her heart. Oh, dang. But she's so sinister. Um, then towards the bottom of the page, the wind began to blow. There was no catch on the window. The window kept banging backwards and forwards. Bang, bang, bang. It's kind of ghostly, isn't it? Mysterious. And then we have another reference to the weather. "And the rain on the roof," I thought. He does not remember the rain on the roof. She's talking about the cottage. It was quite dark. There was no moon. The wind was squally from the west. And then at the top of 285, the wind was with me, but it came in puffs, and I was in the lee there under the cover of the headland. So he's rowing, or maybe he's got a sail, I think, but he's trying to get the boat out into the water, and he's got a dinghy, which is how he's going to get back. The sail thundered and shook. It cracked like a whip above my head. It was so dark, so damn dark, I couldn't see anything. And then he said he drove the spike into the bottom boards. And that's going to become an issue. Next page. Again, the weather is the backdrop. It began to blow and rain very hard. The mystery. I went back and sat by the window in my dressing gown, watching the rain, listening to the sea as it broke there in the cove. So, down at the bottom of 286, the eye speaker says, "Rebecca is dead." That's what we've got to remember. Rebecca is dead. She can't speak. She can't bear witness. She can't harm you anymore. Well, therein is the irony. We'll see it. But everything is based on lies. But then the eye speaker starts to concoct maybe some lies. "We've got to explain it," I said. "We've got to think out a way to explain it. It's got to be the body of someone you don't know, someone you've never seen before." So the lies beget more lies. And there's more at the bottom of 287. "You must say the body in the crypt was a mistake, a ghastly mistake. You must say that you must say that when you went to Edgecombe, you were ill. You did not know what you were doing. You were not sure even. Even then, you could not tell. It was a mistake, just a mistake." She has finally gotten Maxime to care about her, or to say that he does. And she's going to protect it no matter what. But remember this web of lying that's going on at Manderley. Top of 286. They will think the boat capsized and sank when she was in the cabin. I said they will think she went below for a rope, for something, and while she was there, the wind came from the headland and the boat heeled over and Rebecca was trapped. They'll think that, won't they? Well, that's what she hopes they're going to think. Um, Now, occasionally, in the next many chapters, she's going to say something about her stomach feeling bad. I had a sick, expectant feeling at the pit of my stomach, and that comes up quite a bit. And I think what she's, if you ever had anxiety and it sits like a heaviness in your chest, and I think that's what she's talking about. But all she can say to herself is, he did not love Rebecca. He did not love Rebecca. My heart, for all its anxiety and doubt, was light and free. Now that I knew her to have been evil and vicious and rotten, I did not hate her any more. She could not hurt me. Now, just think back to Mrs. Danvers pinching her arm, pinching it really hard, enough to leave bruises. So, who now has become the villain? Uh, Rebecca's power, this is at the top of 290, had dissolved into the air like the mist had done. A few lines later, Maxine had never loved her. I did not hate her any more. She says, I was free of her forever. Then at the end of the next paragraph, I was not afraid. I would fight for Maxine. I would lie and perjure and swear. I would blaspheme and pray. Rebecca had not won. Rebecca had lost. See. Top of 291. The interesting thing about what du Maurier does is she gives us the thought process, how she is justifying or how she has kind of come out from underneath the oppressiveness of Rebecca. 291, here's this pain in her stomach. I felt the little pain come again at the pit of my stomach. That's anxiety. He glanced out of the window. The sky was white and overcast, as it had been when I came away from the cliffs. There was no wind, though. It was still and quiet. And then she says it again, the queer, nagging pain, this is towards the bottom of 291, had not left me yet. And then it was, she mentions it again. It was the same feeling, the same pain. Top of 292. The reporters have gotten wind of the story. Remember how they have such a horror of gossip? Well, the reporters have called. And towards the bottom of 292, it was like an old forgotten nightmare, something remembered months afterwards with doubt and disbelief. We had dinner. Frith served us, returned from his afternoon. His face was solemn and expressionless. Always notice their facial expressions. At the bottom of page 292 to the top of 293, there were no shadows between us anymore. And when we were silent, it was because the silence came to us of our own asking. It was a quiet, still happiness. So ironic. And then in the next paragraph, it must have rained in the night, for when I woke the next morning, just after 7, and got up and looked out of the window, I saw the roses in the garden below were folded and drooping, and the grass banks leading to the woods were wet and silver. So remember how the flowers have come into play. These flowers were cultivated, and now these flowers have been saturated by the rain. And then at the bottom of 293, there were a lot of letters on my plate. Remember, early on in her stay at Manderley, she had no letters. She had nobody to write to except Mrs. Van Hopper, who she hated. Top of 294. The flowers on the mantelpiece were drooping, many of them dead. The petals lay on the floor. And notice how she has come into her own when she's not oppressed by Rebecca. The room has not been touched this morning, I said. Even the windows were shut, and the flowers are dead. Will you please take them away? The flowers, they've been cut, so they're dead. don't let it happen again. So she suddenly says, I had not thought it would be so easy to be severe. She's kind of enjoying her new role. At the bottom of page 294, whatever happened, I must be calm and quiet. Whatever happened, I must not be afraid. I cut my roses and took them into the morning room. The carpet had been dusted and the fallen petals removed. I began to arrange the flowers in the vases. And remember what my book of symbols said about arranging flowers. While there's an art to it, if any of you know how to do this well, there is an art to arranging flowers, but it's also the beginning of a death for the flowers. They die. You cut them, they die. Of course, if you leave them out in the rain, they lose their petals too. So Mrs. Danvers is surprised by, there's a whole conversation here, but Mrs. Danvers is surprised that the eye speaker has become a little assertive. I'm not used to having messages sent to me by Robert. So Mrs. Danvers is kind of taken aback. 296. The eye speaker says, and right in the middle of the page, she can't frighten me anymore, I thought. She has lost her power with Rebecca. Whatever she said or did now, it could not matter to me or hurt me. I knew she was my enemy, and I did not mind. It's when she begins to understand the relationship that she can get out from underneath it. The old sick feeling came back inside me. And then there's a reference to the gardeners mowing the lawn again. Now, just as an aside, I bet you they are using those, remember those push mowers? Of course, I would imagine it will take them forever to cut the lawn that way. I don't think it was a motorized lawnmower. So she began to walk up and down, and Jasper padded after me, wondering why I did not take him for a walk. I went on walking up and down the terrace. Again, people are pacing. Mr. De Winter on the telephone, madam. Oh, Eureka! He's actually asking for her on the phone. We've seen it several times that he calls to inform people that he's delayed or late or something, but he never asked for her, and now he does. So, page 297, an hour dragged past, slow, interminable. Notice the references to time. Time can be very quick or it can be very slow. If you're sitting in the dentist's office, it's very slow, right? And so she says, my face was very white. I pinched some color into my cheek. So it's kind of, it's fake. It's a facade. So here comes the people investigating this dead body. How do you do? He said. He spoke quietly, gravely, like a doctor. Marie must have had an unpleasant experience in the doctor's office because always the analogy. At the top of 298, and herein lies the crux of the whole problem. What makes it so difficult was the fact that your husband identified the first body over a year ago. Remember, Frank was going to go with him, and he said, no, he has to go alone. Well, because he was very fearful that Rebecca's body was going to float up, or the boat was going to be discovered, and it never was. And then he gets this opportunity to identify a different body. Whoa. So they talk about the weather quite a bit. It's an interesting, this page, 299, and the top of 300, small talk at the dinner table, because Frith was standing there, like the elephant in the room. It's a universal instinct of the human species, isn't it? The desire to dress up in some sort of disguise. It's natural, I suppose, for all of us to wish to look different, or to wish to be in a disguise, to be different, to not be the same. And then, of course, people always ask her, do you play golf, Mrs.? And she says, no. But the small talk continues until the top of page 301. And the colonel says again, Colonel Julian, that the awkward part of the whole distressing business is the fact that you identified that original body. Yes, quite, says Maxime. End of the next paragraph. He was not in a fit state to undertake anything of the sort. That's nonsense. I was perfectly well. Remember early on when B was referring to Maxine's health, and he was kind of resentful. He didn't care for that. It's no use going into all that now. You made that first identification. Now the only thing to do is to admit the error. There seems to be no doubt about it this time. And of course, there's going to be an inquest and wretched publicity in the top of 302. The only consolation is that now we know poor Mrs. De Winter's death must have been a swift and sudden, not the dreadful, slow, lingering affair we had all believed it to be. I think it's kind of gruesome that they talk about how quick people die. So if the boat went down, she must have gone down for something, and then the door jammed, and a squall caught the boat without anyone on the helm, said Colonel Julian. A dreadful thing. So remember that the eye speaker had said, maybe that's what they're going to think. And here's Colonel Julian voicing it. So Frank is here. She says, I glanced up and I saw Frank look at Maxime. He looked away again immediately, but not before I had seen and understood the expression in his eyes. Frank knew, and Maxime did not know that he knew. So Frank says, accidents happen so easily, even the most experienced people. Think of the number killed out hunting every season. So here we are watching Colonel Julian manufacture a story, trying to explain what he doesn't know. Over on 303, I did not look at him. I was afraid he would understand my eyes. I did not want him to know that I knew. So, having told her that he killed Rebecca now makes her culpable. And she doesn't want anybody seeing that she knows the real truth. Page 304. There was no trace of what I'd done. The bullet had not touched the bone. He says at the end of this chapter, I only mind for you. He said, I don't regret anything else. If it had come all over again, I should not do anything different. I'm glad I killed Rebecca. I shall never have any remorse for that. Never, never. But you, I can't forget what it has done to you. I was looking at you, thinking of nothing else all through lunch. It's gone forever. That funny, young, lost look that I loved. It won't come back again. I killed that too. When I told you about Rebecca, it's gone. In 24 hours, you are so much older. So there is the summary of this growth we've seen. It's her fall from innocence. And part of it, the start of it was actually her walking down the stairs in that white dress. In an innocent, white is often the color of innocence. And yet she didn't understand the look in Maxime's face. And now we get here, and he sees that she has shed that old innocent self. Page 305. It seems so odd to us, madam, that she should have let herself be trapped like that in the cabin. She was so experienced in a boat. So, of course, the servants are talking, and they think it's odd. And we are most distressed about it outside, meaning outside of the outside is referring to the area of where the servants lurk, and coming suddenly after the party. It doesn't seem right somehow, does it? No, Frith, she says. The top of page 306. I'm afraid the news has been a great shock to Mrs. Danvers. Little insight into her relationship with Rebecca. I can very well manage the ordering, the cook and I between us. wow, she's really asserting herself. That's the I speaker. So at the bottom of this page, it was true, of course, though sprinkled with little inaccuracies. She's talking about what is in the newspapers. Of course, everybody has a horror of that, making it strong meat for the hundreds of readers who wanted value for their pennies. Maxime sounded vile in it, a sort of satyr, like he's the satyr. Who's the satyr? Is it um, Rebecca? We've certainly gotten hints that she is. Um, remember, the satyr represents a sexual desire. But now the newspaper is making Maxime look like that. Over on page 307. Each paper made great play of the fact that Rebecca's body had been found the day after the fancy dress ball, as though there was something deliberate about it. Both papers used the same word, ironic. But we know, from a story point of view, that the irony was deliberate, but it was really the first step in her freeing herself. Right in the middle of the page, at the end of the paragraph, she says, that frightful word of 6 letters. In the middle of the placard, large and black. Well, word of 6 letters is murder. Okay, next page, 308, towards the bottom. I still avoided his eye, but I was more convinced than ever that he knew the truth. And he, in this case, is Frank. And Frank is a good friend to Maxime. And we see kind of a parallel between the relationship between Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca and Frank and Maxime. That they are similar. There's a similarity in the pairing, not in the personality. Okay, let's see. The way he had come to Maxime's aid in his quiet, unobtrusive manner, if there was any question of difficulty. At the bottom of this page, I understood it all. Frank knew, but Maxime did not know that he knew. And we all stood there looking at one another, keeping up those little barriers between us. Top of 309. The weather plays a role again. The weather had not broken yet. It was still hot, oppressive. Like the whole Rebecca thing is oppressive. The air was full of thunder, and there was rain behind the white, dull sky, but it did not fall. I could feel it and smell it, pent up there behind the clouds. The inquest was to be on Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. And then, let's see, who has the measles? Somebody, B's son has the measles, so Du Maurier had to get them out of the way. She has, the eye speaker has the nagging pain again. I did not want anything to eat. I could not swallow. It was a relief when the farce of the meal was over, and I heard Maxime go out to the drive and start up the car. At the bottom of this page, it was like going with someone to a nursing home, someone who was to have an operation, and not knowing what would happen, whether the operation would be successful. There's her anxiety. The next time you have to go to the doctor, just try to feel her her anxiety about sitting out there in the waiting room, and all the time that little nagging pain beneath my heart. That's that anxiety. Over on the next page, she's pacing. I got out of the car and began walking up and down the market square. And then I walked up and down. So the inquest, Maxime and Frank have already gone into the inquest, and she stayed outside. But we see her pacing, 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 pacing. And then there's some testimony from Mr. Tabb, the boat builder. Page 311, it was Maxine I had not wanted to hear. I had been nervous of listening to his evidence. That was why I had not gone with him and Frank in the first place. Now it did not matter. His part was over. And there is Jack Favell. I think it's Favell. He and Mrs. Danvers are at the inquest. It's kind of creepy. At the bottom of page 312, unfortunately, the late Mrs. De Winter relaxed her watchfulness for a moment, and she lost her life, the boat sinking with her up aboard. Kind of spinning that tale as a way to explain how it was. How is it that somebody with her experience can go down with the boat. Over on 313, about a quarter of the way from the bottom. No, sir, said Tab emphatically, it's not. What I want to know is this. Who drove who drove the holes in the planking? Rocks didn't do it. The nearest rock was 5 feet away. Besides, they weren't the sort of marks made by a rock. They were holes done with a spike. Oh, yes, they were. And my first thought was, well, maybe the boat. Well, I mean, I knew that De Winter had punched the holes in the bottom, but I wondered how this was going to be explained away. It's not on the rocks. The boat went down in sand. By now, my own anxiety is increasing. And then we learned that the seacocks had been turned on. They're the faucets. It was hot, much too hot. Why didn't they open the window? We should be suffocated if we sat here with the air like this. And there are so many people all breathing the same air. So many people. I'm sure you've had that feeling. I get it in the jail sometimes because our classroom's really small, and I think to myself, oh, we're all breathing the same air. I wear a mask, just so you know. Next paragraph. It's my opinion, sir, that the boat never capsized at all. She was deliberately scuttled. Maxine's going to be busted. Just thought. It was hot, so very hot. And then at the bottom of this page, oh yes, there's Fable with Mrs. Danvers. The heat was coming up at me from the floor, rising in slow waves. It reached my hands, wet and slippery. It touched my neck, my chin, my face. Is this Rebecca's ghost? Or, more truly, if you have ever fainted, you know that the floor kind of comes up to you. Really, what you're doing is going down to it, but you can feel it as if it's coming up on you. And then she's saying to herself, 315, oh God, don't let Maxime lose his temper. Don't let him lose his temper. Which is why Maurier left that little hint early in the novel from B that Maxime loses his temper once or twice a year. Next page, 316. Therefore, we can put aside the idea that the boat was tampered with maliciously before Mrs. De Winter went for her evening sail. Had that been the case, the boat would have sunk at her moorings. Again, manufacturing that fiction of what really happened. At the bottom of 316, they had to come, of course, those black spots in front of my eyes, dancing, flickering, stabbing the hazy air. And it was hot, so hot, with all those people, all those faces, and no window. Well, she's going to faint. You can imagine the complete terror at the top of page 317, and all the time the ground coming up to meet me. I think I fainted once in my life, and I was in about third grade, and I was in church, and I remember that the pew in front of me came up to my face. Really, I was going down to it, but I remember that very vividly. Will someone take my wife outside? Maxine said. She is going to faint. It was kind of an opportune moment. Where are we? We're actually going to be on time. Next chapter. I'm sorry, she said. Such a stupid thing to do. It was so hot in that room. So very hot. The vision of Rebecca and the story and the heat mirror each other. It's the weather is oppressive, as is Rebecca. And Rebecca at Manderley was oppressive, and now Rebecca, having been found, is oppressive. So down at the bottom, Maxime may be a long time. Why did he say that? What did he mean? Why didn't he look at me? This is Frank. Frank had escorted her out. What? And we wonder, why did he say that? She wonders, why did he say that? Over on page 319, she answers the question. Frank did not answer. He was driving very fast. For the first time since I had known him, he was at a loss for the usual conventional phrase. That meant he was worried, very worried. And usually he was such a slow, careful driver, stopping dead at every crossroads, peering to the right and to the left, blowing his horn at every bend in the road. Now he's driving very fast, and we suspect that he wants to get the missus home and get back to the inquest. Top of page 320. He did not know how much I knew, nor could I tell for certainty how much he knew. We were allies. We traveled the same road. We could not look at one another. They are on a road. They are going back to Manderley. And they get to the property. I noticed for the first time how the hydrangeas were coming into bloom. And the hydrangeas were the ones that were cultivated by Rebecca. She smells like azaleas, but she also cultivated these hydrangeas. Their blue heads thrusting themselves from the green foliage behind. For all their beauty, there was something somber about them, funereal. They were like the wreaths, stiff and artificial, that you see beneath the glass cases in a foreign churchyard, because they represent Rebecca, and she's similarly encased in this case, she was encased in water, encased in the boat. Down at the bottom, page 320, and Maxine beginning to lose his temper, beginning to go white. Top of 321, she envisions, what if Maxine is taken away? At the end of the first incomplete paragraph on 321, she's manufacturing another scenario. No, Mrs. De Winter can't see anyone. Mrs. De Winter has no story to give to the County Chronicle. And another day, weeks that would be blurred and non-existent, Frank at last taking me to see Maxine. He would look thin, queer, like people in a hospital. There's always that analogy with a doctor's office. The sentimental business about abolishing the death penalty simply encourages crime. That's what people are going to say. That's what she thinks people are going to say when they take Maxime away because he killed Rebecca. 21. At the bottom, hanging was quick. Hanging did not hurt. It broke your neck at once. What? Remember, when she was looking out the window and Mrs. Danvers was pinching her arm, and Mrs. Danvers was suggesting that if the icebreaker jumped, she'd break her neck. Interesting. The plotting out of this book, it was just so clever. Someone who had known the governor of a prison, they put that bag over your head and you stand on that little platform and then the door gives way beneath you. It takes exactly 3 minutes to go from the cell to the moment you are hanged. No 50 seconds, someone said. Nope, that's absurd. It should not be 50 seconds. There's a little flight of steps down the side of the shed, down to the pit. The doctor goes down there to look. They die instantly. No, they don't. She's imagining this conversation about the hanging of Maxine. The body moves for some time. This is an absolutely terrifying picture. I'm telling you, I had anxiety over it. The neck is not always broken. Yes, but even so, they don't feel anything. Someone said they did. Someone who had a brother who was a prison doctor said it was not generally known, the expert, of course, because it would be such a scandal. But they did not always die at once. Their eyes are open. They stay open for quite a long time. Oh my gosh, it's terrifying. God, don't let me think about this, she says to herself. At the end of this next paragraph, they say Max de Winter murdered his first wife. I always did think there was something peculiar about him. I warned that fool of a girl she was making a mistake. This is the imagined thought process of Mrs. Van Hopper. Well, she's cooked her goose now, all right. I suppose she'll make a big offer to go on the pictures. Something was touching my hand. Oh, thank gosh, it's Jasper, thrusting his cold, damp nose in my hands. He had followed me up from the hall. Why did dogs make one want to cry? There was something so quiet and hopeless about their sympathy. Jasper, knowing something was wrong, as dogs always do. So, and this Jasper has played a role the whole time. The dog has been the eye speaker's friend, and then here's the dog again. Now, my dog has disappeared. She has now given up giving me that toy. Um, Next paragraph. I must have fallen asleep because I woke suddenly with a start and heard that first crack of thunder in the air. I sat up. The clock said 5. I got up and went to the window. There was not a breath of wind. The leaves hung listless on the trees, waiting. Even the weather is waiting. Nothing is happening. It's not raining. It's not doing anything. The hall was dark because of the menace of the thunder overhead. At the top of page 323. It looks as though the weather was going to break at last, madam. Yes, no rain fell, though. Nothing since those 2 drops on my hand. Down at the bottom of page 323. It's all over. So Max comes home. It's all over, he said. Still, I could not speak or move towards him. Suicide, he said, without sufficient evidence to show the state of mind of the deceased. They were all at sea, of course. They did not know what they were doing. I sat down on the sofa. Suicide? But the motive? What was the motive? Don't forget that the eye speaker is always asking questions. What was the motive? We don't know. Top of page 324. I kept my temper, though, he said. Oh, phew. Seeing you there by the door. Jeez. Sorry. She hates the UPS man. Okay, scared the daylights out of me. Tell me I'm not tense. Seeing you there by the door made me remember what I had to do. If you had not fainted like that, I should never have done it. It brought me up with a jerk. It gave him a moment of pause for him to look at her and know that he needed to save her. So in comes the servants. The solemn ritual went forward as it always did, day after day. And we're going to get a number of references to the passing of time and how steadily it passes. It's funny. Here's one. It's funny, I thought, how the routine of life goes on. Whatever happens, we do the same things, go through the little performance of eating, sleeping, and washing. No crisis can break through the crust of habit. And I'm pretty sure this is the extent to which I asked you to read. Where's my little stop here? Something has to happen this evening, he said. Something at the church. So there's going to be a little burial. I stared at him blankly. Then I understood. They were going to bury Rebecca. I'm just going to finish this page. It's the storm. It won't break, I said. The storm of what's going on around them as well. Only little spots at times. It's there in the air. It won't break. Like the story won't go away. Why in the name of God doesn't it rain? We've got so much to do together, haven't we? We've got to begin all over. They have to start all over. But you can see that there's a change in their relationship. The past can't hurt us if we are together. You'll have children too. After a while he glanced at his watch. It's 6:10. I shall have to be going. It won't take long, not more than half hour. We've got to go down to the crypt. Robert came to clear away the tea at the bottom of the page. It was like any other day, the routine unchanged. So they're waiting. It's like they're waiting for this burial, which will be the end of Rebecca. And I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick up here. Actually, we're going to pick up at the top of page 326 because we'll start with that little funeral. Just going to write that down. Next week, next class, we are going to finish this book. Can you believe it? Can you believe how quickly this went? So I will talk to you again next week. And if you have questions or points you want to make, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you then. Stop.